I said,
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
You're going to wait till 7 o'clock.
I'm just going to practice, Maura. I always like to make sure that I'm the
yes, do.
I can do it. Okay, let's so can you see that?
Yes, absolutely.
And if I do,
You need to do start.
and then is that all right? Can it?
That's,
That's good.
yeah, that's absolutely super.
Okay.
Yeah,
that looks okay. Fantastic.
I don't know why we've got this bit coming up.
What can you see, Moira?
Yeah, I've lost everybody and it's gone on to a Zoom thing. I don't know.
It's probably you're seeing a different screen. So if you just
it's all right.
Okay.
I'm having to reopen it. There we are.
The wonders of Zoom.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I was at a conference this week and almost every speaker started by saying, can you see my PowerPoint? Can you?
Yes.
It doesn't matter how many times you do it, the sort of nervousness.
It's always absolutely the thing. I'm always, oh no, I don't want that. Cancel that.
I think we've got slightly out of the habit of using it, hasn't it? And I think we're now going to have to get back into the habit of using it. Yeah.
We sort of haven't stopped in one sense because so many meetings are on Zoom still, even though the teaching's face to face. So
okay.
It's it's meeting territory. It's
Yeah.
putting everybody in the room and that sort of thing. So,
but are you still able to do lectures face to face?
Yes. Well, I hope with everything is planned for that. So yes, we've kept some online lectures. Actually, the students quite like online lectures.
Oh, okay.
They like the seminars to be face to face.
Yes. Yeah.
So they say they like the lectures because they can stop them and break them up into chunks and
they can record them and see them later.
Yeah.
Big picture she's got behind her.
Nice.
Yeah.
Did you see it?
Yeah. So
The Moira's pictures on me. Right.
You'll be sharing the screen with Vanessa. Now you'll just go on to.
I'll just share it, Moira. If that's you don't need Vanessa, you don't need to share anything else.
I've started recording. So what I'll do is I'll edit the recording to get rid of this bit, because I found in the past that if I hand the host over, I can't then record. So it's just easy to get it going and then I can edit it. So it's over to you now. That's absolutely fine. You can finish it as well.
Yeah.
And everyone's just coming in, aren't they? We're not waiting. We haven't.
Yeah. Everybody's just coming in.
We didn't.
Yeah, I don't know how many people we've got at the moment.
We've got 8.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
We didn't do a waiting room this time around. We thought,
we decided.
So as long as if people can hear us, obviously welcome. But we're just we'll officially start at 7.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's nice to people to see the sort of slightly organised chaos that we have.
Well, I've been having my radiators replaced today, so with new night storage heaters, so it's been total chaos.
Right. Well, I expect my cat to come in and walk over the keyboard shortly.
Well, we had Rory's dog earlier as well, didn't we?
We did, didn't we,
delivery guy. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I know that Rory can't come because I did meet him at a carol service, and he said he was going to a meeting in London. So.
Right.
And Jane hopefully is joining because I asked her to field questions. So
I'm just going to go and hide my phone in a cupboard somewhere. So it doesn't go off if someone rings me.
Yes.
There's more than 8 of us.
Should I just say that?
That's
Well, perhaps people are scared of infection not joining. You might be able to transmit over the airways. It's been such a lovely afternoon today that.
Oh, has it been nice with you, Maura? It's been grim here. The fog has just not lifted at all in Slingsby.
Oh, right.
Very annoying.
Beautiful sunshine.
Oh, I'm very envious.
It's warm
Yeah,
and
noise like
lovely,
that
I
away
hate to
from
Oh,
say,
it's
yeah.
been freezing and chill here, I'm afraid.
Oh, right. Oh. No, it was really nice. So we've got another
Race
3
Course
minutes.
Road, you know where GCHQ is?
Oh.
That's a really, really thick fog.
So you must have been getting sort of the threat from the North Sea, presumably.
I don't think it's the North Sea, Moira, here. I think we're too inland. I think it just sits, and it didn't, you know, it tried valiantly, but it just never seemed to lift. So
No,
No,
sunny Cotswold was lovely.
lovely.
No, exactly. That's so unusual that it was that way around. It was low.
So very warm welcome to everyone. Just a quick,
There's some starting to.
quick suggestion that if you are not yet muted, I'm Kate, I'm the speaker. If you can look at the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom screen, there's a little microphone that says mute. And if you're not muted, until we get to questions, it would be fantastic if we can. Or you can tell me your secret PIN number for your...
Yes, it's always a bit disconcerting when people don't mute, and then you've got sort of noises in the background and things, and people say, "What did you say?" Oh.
Good evening, everybody.
Oh, hello, Jane.
Hello.
Yes, I just remember that you masqueraded under Apple. So
Yes, that's right. Yes, I'm Eve, offering the apple to the rest of you. Okay,
yes.
So don't be tempted. Right. Here
So
we
were you nice and sunny today or not? Were you in?
No, we had thick fog and mist all day, and in fact so much so that I went down to post some letters in the village at about, I suppose, 4:30, and I could barely see the sides of the road. so it really didn't clear at all.
No, we were the same, Jane. It was dismal.
Yeah. Well, it is December, and you know, I suppose we're British, we should be used to it, but we live. What is it about? I mean, you know, when I was born, people were expecting fine weather, and they're still waiting. So I thought about being British, you know,
because we're eternal optimists, Jane.
That's right.
Yes.
Right,
well,
okay.
The fact that we're still planning a programme for next year just shows how much of an optimist we are. Really.
Yes. No, I think you know, facing reality is not a trend that we wish to encourage. No. I think you know, let's live in the alternate universe. Much better.
Right. Well, anyway, I see from my computer it's 7 o'clock. I'm a great believer in trying to start things promptly on time.
Yeah.
So
I've
start now. So
Adobe.
Sorry. Yeah. So if everybody is muted, apart from me and the speaker at the moment, that would be very helpful. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust series of winter Zoom talks. As you can remember, when we had to cancel or postpone many of our events earlier in the year, we decided to try this experiment of having some Zoom talks, and they proved very popular. Many people wrote in and said how much they'd appreciated them. So we decided that we would try some more, not thinking that possibly there would be another scourge of the pandemic, but nevertheless, we thought in the winter people would prefer Zoom talks. So the first of them is going to be this one by Kate, and then it'll be followed in January, February, and March by 3 more. And if you look at the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust excellent website, you'll find all the details and the dates and the details of those under events. Now, for some of you who perhaps are not members of the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust, do consider joining. The trust. What the trust does is it provides money for the repair and maintenance of churches, chapels and meeting houses throughout Yorkshire. Thanks to the support from members and friends and sponsors, each year to give something like in the sum of about £100,000 a year, which is very much greatly appreciated by the church. So for details, more details about it, do again look at the website. Well, that's the commercial over. So we now come to the important part of the programme, and I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Kate Giles, of the Department of Archaeology and the Centre for Christianity and Culture at the University of York. Now, most of you will remember that last time Kate spoke about the wall paintings at Pickering Church. I'm very pleased to say that the book on the paintings will be out in the spring. And if it's anything like the talk, it will be both entertaining, informative, and amusing. There were some very amusing parts in that talk. This evening, she's going to talk about another of her current projects, and that is the wall paintings in the medieval guild chapel at Stratford on Avon, where she's been working with local partners for a few years. And there are apparently some exciting developments proposed for 2022. So Kate said that she will talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll answer questions. So over to you, Kate. And so please do make certain that you are muted. I will now mute myself as well.
Thank you so much, Moira. So anybody wrestling with Zoom, if you just look in the corner of your screen, you should see a little microphone. And if it's not got a line through it, it means you're unmuted and we can hear everything you say, which could be entertaining. But if you unmute at the end, we can take questions just from the floor, or you can post them in the chat function if you know how to do that. There are various buttons at the bottom you can use to raise a hand, or you can just wave at the screen if you prefer. So I'll just share my screen and we'll make a start. So as Moira said, I have been very privileged for a few years now to be working in Stratford Upon Avon with a variety of projects related to a group of what are really a remarkable collection of late medieval buildings. And you see both the Guild Chapel that I'm going to talk about on the top left-hand side here, but also the Guild Hall and the tower of the chapel next to it, and an associated row of almshouses on the first slide here. Now, the Guild of the Holy Cross, who were responsible for building these remarkable buildings, are extremely well documented, and it's one of the great joys of working in Stratford Upon Avon that not just are there wonderful documents preserved mostly in the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, but also a group of scholars such as Mari MacDonald, Bob Behrman, who I've come to know over the past 10 years very, very closely, and whose scholarship has made our work on the buildings so much easier. So we know that the Guild of the Holy Cross was founded in the late 13th century by Robert de Stratford and brethren and sisters. They were granted a charter, and they were, like many medieval guilds, permitted to build a chapel for divine service and a hospital with priests associated with it. Like many other medieval guilds, they were recorded in the 1389 parliamentary returns. These are a wonderful source. They come out of a sense of slight paranoia from the monarchy about what were these groups doing, why were they meeting in the wake of the Peasants' Revolt. And it has led to a wonderful series of parliamentary records where guilds were required to tell the Crown what were they up to. And many of them emphasised their charitable functions, their spiritual functions, and played down any suggestion that they owned land or property. It's a common theme from guilds, and they do it again at the Reformation. Like many other religious guilds, they were primarily there to support each other's spiritual welfare. But in towns like Stratford upon Avon, religious guilds like the Holy Cross were also the kind of social and cultural life of the town. They oversaw feasting events, celebratory events, and particularly they looked after their members' funerals. So there would be a vigil by the deathbed, then there would be a funeral procession and burial at the local parish church. Now, the Guild Chapel is very interesting in that those of you who will know Stratford upon Avon will know that the parish church is on a slight rise in the ground by the River Avon. It's just outside the main centre of the town, whereas the Guild of the Holy Cross established their chapel right at the heart of the medieval townscape. It leads to a lot of confusion amongst tourists who are looking for Shakespeare's grave in the Guild Chapel, but actually it was also very strategic. It meant that it was at the physical as well as the cultural heart of life in the town. Throughout the early 15th century, there were successive charters granted to the Guild, and their records providing the members' names and details of their feasts have all been edited by Mari MacDonald in this wonderful register. And you can see an overview of the site they occupied, Chapel Lane and Church Street here on the right-hand side. In the 15th century, the Guild had a real sort of high point in its existence. It first of all rebuilt its Guild Hall. So that's the building you see on the top left-hand side here. We have both tree ring dating, which confirms the documentary evidence for the rebuilding of the Guild Hall. And the archaeological evidence of this building is very, very similar to the examples many of you will be familiar with from York, like the Merchant Adventurers Hall or St Anthony's Hall in the city. It's a two-storey timber-framed building, and like many medieval guild halls, it really shows off its timber framing. It's what I like to call timber bling. As much timber as you can put in the facade, jettied over the first floor, with a ground floor given over to probably parlours for chaplains, and a little mini chapel for the priests of the guild, even though the guild chapel was just next door, and then a first floor feasting hall above. So very, very similar to the Merchant Adventurers Hall. We have records of the carpenter who was paid for the construction of the hall. And we also have a record made in 1425 for the consecration of this tiny little mini chapel that you can see illustrated at the bottom left-hand corner here. As we zoom up into the timbers inside the Guild Hall, we've got some exquisite reminders of just how colourful these interiors were. I hope you can make out the stenciled decoration on these timbers. We've got some roses, and these are sometimes erroneously thought to be Tudor roses. They're not, of course. They are symbols of the Virgin, who was the Rose of Roses, and a very important devotional focus for the Guild. Underneath that rose, little stencil, you can see a crowned M monogram. So that again is a symbol of the Virgin. And then we have the IHS symbol as well. And on the left-hand side, on the lower left-hand side, you can see a reconstruction of just how colourful and bright those stencil decorations would have been. At the far end of the chapel, I think somebody still has their microphone on. I'm so sorry. If you could just check and turn it off if that's possible. At the far end of the lower Guild Hall, we've got this beautiful painted reredos. Now, it might not look like much today. You can see there are a pair of shields, and then in between them, three figures, a central figure flanked by two nimmed or haloed figures either side. And in the conservation work that we've carried out recently, we're able to tell a lot more about these figures. We've got a central figure, which is the throne of mercy, God cradling Christ with the Holy Ghost above him, flanked by the Virgin on his right, and then St. John on his left. And then above them, we have two coats of arms, the royal arms and the arms of the Despenser family, the Beauchamps, who, of course, in the Warwickshire area are the kind of top dogs. Now, one of the really intriguing things about the image on the left-hand side, so on your right, as you're looking at the screen, of St. John, is a question of which St. John this is. We would normally expect this to be St. John the Evangelist, but the Guild of the Holy Cross had amalgamated with two other religious fraternities, one dedicated to the Virgin and one to John the Baptist. And so in our early analysis of this scheme, we wondered whether this figure might be St. John the Baptist. However, in the restoration work, the conservation work, this remarkably well preserved figure, literally, well, we got permission from Historic England to remove some yellow ochre. And I hope you can see, if I just hover my cursor over it, this incredible figure of St. John the Baptist popping out of the timber. And I'll just show you a close-up of him. There he is. Incredible. We would never have known he was there if our conservators, the Perry Lithgow Partnership, hadn't just been curious about what lay behind this later 16th century wash of yellow ochre. And the reason he has been preserved is that he's painted on the timber. So there he is holding the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, in his arms. I always think the medieval Agnus Dei looks much more like a stoat than the Lamb of God myself, but he's an absolutely incredible figure. And when visitors see him emerging from the timbers, they really are quite moved in their experience. Now, we've been able to use the evidence of our findings to do a reconstruction drawing of what that reredos might have looked like originally. It's always intrigued us that it seems slightly imbalanced. One would expect there to be another figure balancing St. John the Baptist on the other side of the Virgin. And I wonder whether there was actually a statue on the altar in front of it, or another piece of guild art that actually was a symbol of another saint to which the guild was devoted. And this image now is used by the Guildhall when they present this area of the building to the public. It scrolls down on a screen and then it's removed to reveal the surviving image of St. John the Baptist beneath. So moving upstairs in the Guildhall, so we're still in the Guildhall at the moment here. Here's our feasting hall. On the left-hand side, we're looking towards the dais end, the high end of the hall. Medieval Guildhalls were just like large domestic feasting halls. They had a high end and a low end with a buttery and a pantry. So we have a high end with a dais, and we can imagine this is where the master and the wardens of the guild would have sat during the guild feasts. There's a lovely evocation of that in one of Chaucer's tales. And then looking at the other end of the hall, we have the low end, and the area where you see these benches, these chests today, was the buttery and pantry of the hall, with a small corridor down the side giving access to an adjacent room in the south wing, and also to a little guardrobe, which you might just be able to make out. I'll hover my cursor over it in the corner, just at the low end of the hall. Today, it's now displayed as Shakespeare's schoolroom, which indeed we think it probably was in the 16th century. The desks that you see there are 18th century, although there is one surviving original 16th century desk on loan from the Birthplace Trust. And the chests that you see there are replica seating made for the opening of the building, thanks to funding from the National Lottery. In the adjacent south wing, we've also got more wall painting. This is a room that was used by the master of the school that the guild supported. And here we've got further wall painting. This has been the subject of a lot of debate over the course of the summer. Our experts, the Perry Lithgow Partnership, analysed this painting very closely, and their findings were that this was a curtain, a decorative textile depiction on the wall. Jonathan Foyle, perhaps more interestingly, but slightly more controversially, has suggested this is an image of the Last Supper, with the figures, the shields that you see at the top of the wall, actually nimmed figures of Christ and the apostles, probably or possibly with images in between on the timbers of other figures. But we looked very, very hard, since that was one of our questions when we were looking at this painting, and we could not find any evidence for that. So take your pick, whichever of those interpretations you prefer. Now, the Guild didn't just have a feasting hall, it was also a charitable foundation. Again, like many of the York Guild halls, it had a community of poor men and women whose function it was to say prayers and masses for the souls of the Guild. And again, we have a remarkable surviving document, this time dating from 1502, which is the will of Thomas Hannis or Handis, who wanted to create, as part of his legacy, a new suite of almshouses. And his will gives us incredible detail about how large they should be. He wanted them to be set around a courtyard, and he also wanted them to have a hall and an oratory and a little parlour associated with them. Now, this building, it's very dangerous when you invite archaeologists to look at your building sometimes, because this building had been known for decades as the pedagogue's house or the schoolhouse. It was thought to date to the early 15th century because of an account from 1427, which referred to a bequest made to an early schoolhouse. And this was terribly convenient for the grammar school, who still occupy the building, because this was the headmaster's office. So he liked to think that he was sitting in one of the earliest purpose-built timber-framed schoolhouses in the country. Sadly, the tree ring dating came back 100 years later at 1502, but this allowed us to suggest perhaps that this was actually part of the almshouse complex, accommodating that hall, parlour, buttery, kitchen and a little chapel as well, rather than the early schoolhouse. That didn't stop us going looking for the early schoolhouse, and we did find it. This is the first building in the row of almshouses abutting the Guildhall itself. And there's a stratigraphic relationship. I hope you can just make out where the roofs abut each other and the rest of the almshouses butt up against this single bay building here, two-storey single bay building. And again, tree ring dating has allowed us to confidently state that this building, the timbers were felled in 1425, making a very nice link with our 1427 references. And also later deeds which describe these buildings in the 1560s as the old school with a chamber over it. So the early grammar school at Stratford on Avon was very small indeed, a single room, not so dissimilar from many of the dame schools which perhaps people remember in rural areas in this country in the early 20th century. So we've been able to shed new light both on the old school and on the construction of the almshouses. And clearly Hannis's vision of a courtyard complex was not realised by his executors. Instead, they arrayed them in this really long single range right the way along Church Street. And it really does maximise the investment of Hannis, makes a really powerful statement to the rest of Stratford upon Avon about his wealth and patronage. So turning our attention to the adjacent Guild Chapel itself, again, we have amazing records for this building in the Guild accounts. We know that sections of the building, so if you look closely at the chancel here, you can see some early fabric dating to the 13th century. The majority of the facing stone on the building today is actually 20th century. It underwent a major restoration overseen by Stephen Dykes-Bower in the 20th century, and the masonry was in really appalling condition before that. But every effort was made by Dykes-Bower to replicate the architectural detailing of the medieval chapel. We know that there were periods of investment in the chapel in the 15th century. New altar stones were brought from Warwick. We also have some lovely records to painters for painting within the chapel, and the reconsecration crosses inscribed around the chapel for that rededication, along with the purchase of frankincense for that rededication ceremony. So lots of rebuilding going on in the mid part of the 15th century. But for me, it begins to get really interesting at the end of the 15th century, when another major patron and wealthy merchant from Stratford upon Avon called Hugh Clopton leaves in his will a substantial sum of money to a range of buildings in Stratford upon Avon. Now, Hugh Clopton is the local, younger son of the local manorial family, the Cloptons. He knows he's not going to inherit the manor, or he thinks he's not going to inherit. And so he becomes apprenticed to a London mercer, John Rue. He joins the London mercers in the 1460s, and he rises through the ranks, becoming Sheriff of London. That explains, he also, in the same year as he's Sheriff of London, he's also Master of the Guild of the Holy Cross. And he undertakes that role in absentia. Not surprising, he's in London feasting a lot of the time. So he's obviously roped in to do a second stint as Master of the Guild a couple of years later. He's also an envoy for Richard III. He's traveling all across the continent. And indeed, he gets into a bit of trouble when he's involved in negotiating trade deals with Burgundy. He's discovered to have tried to smuggle £3,000 worth of goods into the country without paying the requisite taxes. And he has to apologise humbly to the mercers and buy them a new hauling of arras, a hanging an arras tapestry for the Mercers' Hall in London by means of apology. In 1491, however, he becomes Lord Mayor of London, and we'll come back to the significance of that later, but it really is a sort of Dick Whittington story, albeit that he came from a local manorial family. When he dies, he never marries. It's absolutely intriguing. He lives a good life and dies in 1496 without heirs. And he leaves an astonishing amount of money to Stratford Upon Avon, to London, to the major monastic houses within and between Stratford Upon Avon and London. He is responsible for building New Place. This is the house, of course, that Shakespeare wanted to live in later. And this is a beautiful new watercolour reconstruction drawing that Philip Watson has produced for us, imagining New Place in Hugh Clopton's time. And he also built himself 2 tombs. Why have one tomb when you can have 2? So he's hedging his bets about where he's going to die. If he dies in London, he's to be buried in St Margaret's, Lothbury, and we think probably that would have been a brass. It's a pretty crowded church by that date. But in Stratford Upon Avon's parish church, he can build himself this beautiful chest tomb. That's the tomb on the lower part of the slide on the right hand side. He never uses it. He dies in London, and so he's buried there. But gradually, this is the Lady Chapel of the Church of Holy Trinity, and gradually the Clopton family then take it over for their own manorial Clopton Chapel, and that's what you see there today. So when he dies, he leaves money he builds a new bridge in Stratford Upon Avon. You may well have crossed that bridge, leaves money to the parish church, and he also leaves money for the Guild Chapel. And this is the extract from his will, where he describes having bargained with Downland, who's a local mason, and diverse other craftsmen. He's sort of presenting this story as if he's paid for the complete rebuilding of the chapel. We know, of course, that there was a lot of work that had already gone on before the 1490s, but we do think that he undertakes to create a really interesting scheme of wall paintings inside the church, and I'm going to come on and talk about those in a moment. So in the next part of the lecture, what I want to do is to talk about how we have gone about reconstructing Hugh Clopton's 1496 onwards Guild Chapel. Well, much like the evidence that I presented to you about Pickering, we can draw on a rich seam of antiquarian research, again from the 19th century. And it's a very similar story in terms of a discovery of a set of medieval wall paintings, this time in 1804. So we're 50 years earlier than the discovery of the paintings in Pickering. And this is very, very early days. This is the era, for example, where the St. Stephen's Chapel wall paintings were being discovered, but they were very, very evidently Catholic. And so we have the same reaction really in Stratford Upon Avon to the discovery of these paintings. We have two major sources of evidence for them when they were discovered in 1804. The first is a description by a local antiquarian, Wheeler, and he describes the paintings in great detail, including their condition, noting that they have suffered from some iconoclasm. He also notes that they were in a poor condition. But there's also a wonderful series of lithographs created by a gentleman called Thomas Fisher. He's an antiquarian who is working primarily with people like Richard Gough on his volume on sepulchral monuments. He's also a searcher of the records. He's an FSA, and he's particularly interested in pioneering what he calls polyautography. He writes lots of opinionated letters to the Gentleman's Magazine, including why you should use lithography rather than engraving, because it's much cheaper and because you can make your artistic mark on the paintings. And you see one of his lithographs here, which is part of the legend of the discovery of the Holy Cross by the Empress Helena. Now, unfortunately, Fisher is quite an interesting character when you read his letters. And one of the things that happens is that he falls out spectacularly with his publisher, not something I intend to do with mine at all. There's a requirement for 9 copies of any major monograph to be deposited with a series of libraries at the time. And these lithographs, although they are cheaper to produce than engravings, they are all hand coloured by Fisher. And so he resents the idea that he might be creating 9 copies of his drawings to give away. And he writes letters to Parliament. He gets on his soapbox about this sort of thing. And although he releases a series of these lithographs in parts to subscribers, he never actually publishes the final volume because he dies young, very suddenly. And it is his sister who petitions his good friend, John Gough Nichols, who's the editor of the Gentleman's Magazine, to actually bring this publication to light in 1838. So it takes her a long time. And again, wonderful letters with her really campaigning for her brother's vision to be realized in publication. And I've often looked at these lithographs and wondered, the justification that essentially these images were falling off the wall, to me does not seem to be borne out when you look at the detail of the paintings themselves. Clearly there was a lot visible in 1804. Here are some more examples from the published volume by Nichols. So here we have that scene of the discovery of the true cross, and that, of course, is part of the dedication of the guild. We know that these were in the chancel of the chapel originally, and just note also the extent to which there was black letter inscription with these paintings in English. So we have a really interesting use of the vernacular in the 1490s accompanying this story. There were other paintings in the chancel too. We have this rather interesting pair of dragons over the vicar's door. An image to the left of it, obviously the crucified Christ with a bishop, possibly the Bishop of Worcester, possibly one of the meant to be the founder of the guild. The figure with the hat behind the hill is sort of a gigantic, almost like a Monty Python figure almost. We've wondered whether that's Hugh Clopton himself being depicted. We've got a series of heraldic shields relating to important members of the guild or local notable families. And we have devotional images like the 5 wounds of Jesus, which are a rather grisly but very popular devotional image, of course, in this period. Over the chancel arch, here we have a doom painting, and this really is one of those. I was just reading the latest Historic Churches magazine, and there's a wonderful article on the doom at St Thomas's in Salisbury, not a dissimilar date, and a very interesting story of Victorian restoration there too. But the doom at Stratford on Avon is beautifully documented here by Fisher. The only detail that his technology, his lithographic technology, really doesn't pick up on is the detail of the flowers in the grass surrounding the souls rising from their graves. We're going to see that in a moment. But he does record in fantastic detail the grisly torments awaiting those poor unfortunate souls who are being dragged down on the right hand side of our image to hell. And you might notice that various of them are holding scrolls in Latin bearing the 7 deadly sins. So you can find out what's going to happen to you if you are guilty of pride or greed or luxury. On the right-hand side, as we're looking at it, of Jesus sitting on his rainbow, we have St. John the Baptist, that patron saint of the Guild, and on Christ's right, your left, we've got the Virgin, and behind her we have saved souls going up to meet St. Peter at the gates of heaven. And note how many of them have mitres and crowns, so they seem to be going in the right direction. I note no bishops or royal members of the royal family going the other way, dragged down by demons to the cauldron bubbling away in hell. And we also have some lovely musician angels like we also find in remnants of carving from the chapel depicted in the paintings. We've also, as part of the records that Fisher made, we know we had the martyrdom of Becket. This is far less restrained than the Pickering version. This is Becket being stabbed in a grisly depiction, rather similar perhaps to the Caxton woodcut illustrations we get towards the end of this period as well. And indeed, we think there may have been a personal association between Caxton and Hugh Clopton. Underneath Becket, we have this wonderful allegorical poem, Earth Upon Earth, and this is a memento mori poem. This is a reminder that we're all going one way. We'll all end up as a shrouded corpse in the grave, being eaten by worms. And there's a Latin inscription as well as the vernacular poem, and I've just shown you a detail here of that inscription at the bottom: whoso him bethought inwardly and oft, how hard it is to flit from bed to pit, from pit to pain, that never shall say certain, who would not do no sin, all the world to win. So this is really, laying it on thick. We're all going to be judged for our sins. You'd better join the Guild of the Holy Cross, then we can pray for your soul. On the other side of the west wall, we have St. George and the Dragon, a rather lovely depiction here, not just of St. George and the Dragon, but the princess chained behind him, watching on, cheering on St. George, and her parents rather nervously looking out from the tower above them. And below her, we have this rather intriguing lady. We think this is the Whore of Babylon. So we've got really interesting inscriptions here in Latin that we're hoping. We have no idea whether this image survives, actually, the Victorian hand of restoration. She might have been a bit much for the Victorians, but this is a really wonderful image and one we're hoping to kind of know more about through collaborative research as we proceed in the course of our project this coming year. Now, many of those paintings were damaged, not just by the reformers in the 16th century, but by the Victorians and indeed the Georgians. So we're looking here at a photograph from the 50s taken as the chapel was being restored. And we're looking towards the west wall here, and you can see absolutely typical. We've got a west gallery, and that has absolutely been smashed up against the images of Becket and St. George and the Dragon. So really very little of those images survived that, that intervention, shall we say, of the West Gallery. And the paintings, although they were discovered in 1804, rather like Pickering, they were plastered over again or destroyed completely. It was not until the 1920s, and you might remember we talked about Ernest William Tristram when we talked about Pickering. Tristram came to Stratford, he knew about the story of the paintings, and he uncovered the Doom painting particularly. So he removed the layers of plaster. He realized that some of the details of the painting had been lost, although you'll see his beautiful watercolor drawings here, stone by stone drawings of the Doom. And here we get that real detail of the floral imagery surrounding those souls rising from the grave. So there are 2 watercolor drawings in the V&A collections of the Doom, a main Doom scene, and then this sort of close-up of those floral images. Unfortunately, you might remember that Tristram had a rather controversial conservation technique, and he covered the whole of the Doom here at Stratford on Avon, as he did in Pickering with a mixture of wax and turpentine, thought to be a preservative, but we now know absolutely disastrous for letting medieval wall paintings breathe. So his restoration work really contributed to the deterioration of the paintings after he had recorded them, sadly. Now, Tristram only uncovered the Doom painting, but in the 1950s, as proposals were brewing for refitting the chapel out to look more like an Oxford college, and the Victorian pulpit, pews and gallery were removed, a local art teacher at the grammar school, the wonderfully named Wilfrid Pudderfat, was aware that there were other paintings that records suggested should have been in the Guild Chapel, but had never been seen in 1804. Particularly, he knew about John Stowe, the antiquarian's manuscript of Leyland's itinerary, so that John Leyland, the great early 16th century antiquarian, had visited Stratford Upon Avon, like he did many towns. And in John Stowe's personal copy of Leyland's itinerary, he had made a note in the margin that there was once a Dance of Death painting around the walls of the chapel. Now, this painting, the Dance of Death, was very common across Europe in the later Middle Ages. It was known in England as the Dance of Paul's because there was a depiction of the Dance of Death around the cloister of Old St. Paul's Cathedral. But those paintings at St. Paul's Cathedral were known to have been destroyed by the Duke of Somerset. So Pudderfat set off to look for the Dance of Death painting, and he found it. Oops. Oh, I don't know what's happened to my next slide. Oh, here he is. There we are. So you might be able to make out here, here's Pudderfat with his tape measure. And if you just look to the right-hand side of the tape measure, you might be able to make out some lettering in the surface of the stones. And just above that lettering, some long, thin skeletal legs. And those are the lower portions of the cadavers that are part of the Dance of Death painting. So this just gives you a sense of what Pudderfat was actually seeing on the walls of the chapel that he set about recording in remarkable detail. Now, he did two things. He made drawings and measurements, but he also took colour photographs of both the walls of the nave of the chapel. And these are photomosaic montages, which we have created from individual colour slides in the collection of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and rectified. So we now have an accurate record of what it was that Pudderfat saw. Now, at the moment, these look a bit of a mess. We can really zoom in close up in detail and examine these. And you'll see that we've got a lot of different things going on in these images. We have the Dance of Death in the in the upper image here, but we also in the lower section have another series of paintings on the opposite wall, which Pudderfat identified as being related to the life of Adam. Now, the life of Adam comes from the book of Genesis, and iconographically it's connected with the story of the legend of the Holy Cross, because when Adam dies, seeds are planted in his mouth, and the tree that grows from them become the trees that are used in the crucifixion, and thus the tree that the Empress Helena discovers in her excavations. Helena, of course, is the patron saint of archaeologists. But we can also see from these images that there are later schemes of painting. Perhaps you can make out on the bottom image a column in the middle of the painting. So there's a scheme of architectural painting that overlays the medieval paintings and probably dates to the late 16th and 17th century. Now, Pudderfat's drawings, he drew the paintings, and he was really determined to transcribe the detail of the Dance of Death, which was recorded by John Lydgate in a published poem in several different manuscripts. And Pudderfat set out to connect the Stratford version of the Dance of Death with the Group B manuscripts, which are held by the Bodleian Library. In fact, there are some minor variations between them, which suggest that the Stratford manuscript is a kind of lost version of the Dance of Death poem. But nevertheless, there are great connections between these surviving manuscripts and the paintings themselves. And from that, he produced these beautiful reconstruction drawings. So this is a detail of one of the scenes, a typical image from the Dance of Death with the great and the good, a bishop and a king being led down by death. Death speaketh, Sir Patriarch, full led and humble of cheer. Basically, death is saying, it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to come on this dance with me to judgment and your eternal fate. And above the Latin, above the English inscription, sorry, we have Latin text as well. And this juxtaposition of Latin and English is common on both sides of the walls. And we've wondered recently whether it was a really good way of educating the boys from the grammar school, where they could be brought into the chapel to read the English, but also translate the Latin. And Padafat produced this less detailed, but more evocative, perhaps, reconstruction of the Dance of Death as it must have appeared on the whole wall of the chapel shortly after the death of Clopton and the realization of his painted scheme, alongside images of saints and stained glass coats of arms, some of which we know survived into the 16th century. So the overall message, what was Clopton's vision? Well, I've alluded to this already. The overall message is, I'm a very pious merchant. I'm very fond of the Guild of the Holy Cross, but I'm aware that even though I'm super wealthy and mixing with the great and the good, I will be judged too. So I have to prepare for a good death by being a good Christian, by giving money to charity. And he must have been drawing on a whole series of texts, many of which perhaps Hugh Clopton owned. We've wondered whether many of the sources for the paintings in the chapel were actually part of his library in New Place. And who knows, maybe books from that library made their way into Shakespeare's library later on. We certainly know that there are sources like the Golden Legend, printed by Caxton, the Cursa Mundi, the Northern Passion, as well, of course, as the Danse Macabre. And the scheme also draws on sources that we've discussed in the context of Pickering as well, things like John Merck's Festial and the Lay Folks Catechism. So there's a real sense of lay literacy being communicated in the scheme itself. Now, we've been able at the university, this is a student project, a master's project, where we took those antiquarian records, particularly Fisher's lithographs, but Puddafat's reconstruction of the Dance of Death, and we've created a virtual reality model of the paintings as they were seen by those antiquarians and projected them into the space of the building that we see today. We've stripped out the current fixtures and fittings of the chapel to give people an impression of what that might have looked like as the paintings were being created on whitewashed walls. Turning our attention to the west wall. Again, this is what we might have seen. At the time that we did this reconstruction drawing, which is about 10 years ago now, we didn't know about the life of Adam, so that's missing from this reconstruction. But there we have the Martyrdom of Becket, the Memento Mori poem, the St. George and the Dragon, and the Whore of Babylon. Now, the final part of this story, I suppose, is really what happened to the paintings at the Reformation. And here there is a really tantalizing Shakespearean connection. John Shakespeare, William Shakespeare's father, was a chamberlain in Stratford Upon Avon. And in the accounts for the year in which he's chamberlain, he records payments for defacing the images in the chapel, and the following year for taking down the rood loft in the chapel. Now, 1563 to 5 is very, very late indeed to be causing damage to paintings or removing a rood loft in the chapel. So we've had a lot of debate about whether these were new paintings which had been painted in the chapel in the 1550s under Mary, or actually, and I'm more convinced by this argument, whether at the Reformation, the guild, who were disbanded, of course, at the Reformation, simply locked the door of the chapel and mothballed it. And one of the compelling reasons why that might have been the case is that the guild spent several years after the Reformation petitioning to become the new corporation of Stratford on Avon, the new town council. And once they had done that, 9 members of the new council were former members of the guild or their sons or nephews. They basically reclaimed all the guild assets. They re-inhabited the guild hall for their corporation headquarters. It became the town council headquarters, and they reappropriated the chapel as their corporation chapel. So it's possible that some of the paintings, at least, even if they were given one coat of whitewash, were still visible or became visible again in the 1560s when John Shakespeare was ordered or made orders for them to be covered up again. That would also fit with John Stowe's comments that the Dance of Death may have been visible even as late as the 1570s. Now, the wording of Stowe's manuscript annotation is ambiguous. It's possible that he was simply told that the Dance of Death was there, or it's possible that he actually saw it. It's not so controversial that it wouldn't have, it could have survived the Reformation. So it's possible that that actually was still visible. And if Stowe saw it, it's not inconceivable that William Shakespeare himself might have seen it, crept into the chapel perhaps when his father was chamberlain, borrowed the key and seen some of these ghostly and quite macabre images flickering in the candlelight inside the chapel. Further evidence that something at least survived in the chapel as late as the 1630s is provided by another documentary record. We know that a partition of some kind was constructed between the nave and chancel of the chapel. And in the 1630s, the local vicar was criticised for having profaned the chapel, as you see here, because his children had been playing football inside it. He'd been using it as a sort of laundrette. He'd been hanging his clothes up to dry in it. His pigs and his poultry had been in it, and his dogs had been lying in it. And the record notes the pictures therein were defaced and the windows broken. So what images were still visible as late as the 1630s that the Reverend Thomas Wilson was defacing them? It's an intriguing reference. And again, we'd love to know more about this. So where does that leave us? As Maura started by saying, why should you join the Historic Churches Trust? The Guild Chapel at Stratford on Avon, like many other places of worship, is maintained by a faithful group of volunteers. It's part of the corporation's property, the Stratford Town Trust property, but they don't have lots of surplus money to undertake conservation or restoration work. It's open every day to the public in normal times. And so we really wanted to help them apply for funding from the lottery to begin conservation work to remove at least Tristram's damaging wax and turpentine preservative from the Doom. So a few years ago, we supported a successful lottery fund bid, and we were delighted in 2018 when that project to remove that wax and turpentine and conserve the painting was awarded the Sir John Betjeman Award for Conservation. And that's given us a real appetite for working together over the subsequent years. So at the university, one of the things we really wanted to do was to harness our students' and colleagues' enthusiasm for digital heritage So we've worked to curate or co-curate with the volunteers online exhibitions. We've created a virtual app that can be used by people with augmented reality. So when you hold up your iPad to the Doom as it is today, you can see what it might have looked like with those beautiful antiquarian paintings plastered over it. And this summer, as the chapel was forced to close, like many religious buildings, we applied for cultural recovery funding, and we were awarded that. And we've created a COVID-safe Clopton trail around Stratford Upon Avon. This funding provided really important support, not just for the chapel, installing Wi-Fi, for example, in the chapel, but also support for a local acting company, Auntie Jen Productions, and a local film company, Ignite Creative. And we have created a fictional apprentice wall painter who is working on Clopton's Guild Chapel and who shows you around Stratford on Avon in a quest for breakfast early on a summer's morning. We started filming at 4:30 in the morning in Stratford on Avon to capture this footage. But this is now available as a freely downloadable web app. And it's been used a lot over the course of the summer, not just by visitors, many of whom, of course, are eking out their kind of funds as they go around different heritage attractions. And this is free to download. All the buildings and sites we feature here are free to access, but also by people wanting to visit Stratford Upon Avon, but not being able to visit. So it's a virtual tour of the town. And perhaps some of those people we hope then might be encouraged to visit when they feel able and when circumstances are right. So we've had huge uptake for this virtual web app, and we're really delighted with it. And that has enabled us to also continue with our fundraising plans for revealing the next phase of the paintings. So this is our wonderful, one of our wonderful conservators, Richard Lithgow, and he's showing you here glimpses of the Dance of Death and Life of Adam paintings behind the panelling inside the chapel. And we have just heard that we've got successful funding from the Pilgrim Trust to begin to explore options about how we can remove the panelling safely, have a look at what is beneath the whole scheme of panelling across the walls, put the panelling back on, and then think about solutions both for conservation and adapting the panelling in the long term. That's really important for us because the panelling, as you can see here, is part of Stephen Dijksbouwer's scheme for the chapel. So the 20th Century Society are very fond of Dijksbouwer, and we need to work in partnership with them, as well as with our conservator partners, to find the right solution together. Now, the final piece of that jigsaw puzzle for me at the moment has been to be part of a crowdfunding appeal. We needed £6,000 to reach our target to work on the panelling and do the conservation costing. So we did a little film and did a crowdfunding appeal, and I'm delighted to say at the end of November we reached our target. In fact, we actually smashed our target. So we're really pleased with the £6,000 we've just raised for that, and we can't wait to take the panelling off the wall, have a look at what lies beneath it, and then share our findings both with the wider public and with funders, and go back to lottery, we hope, for a new scheme of conservation and heritage apprenticeships as part of that scheme and project over the next 2 or 3 years. So I hope that's given you a taste of the work we've been doing at Stratford Upon Avon. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So you are very welcome to turn your cameras back on and to unmute yourselves, post a question in the chat if you're interested in finding out more, or just shout out if you'd like to know anything more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate. But I know that Jane is going to give a vote of thanks shortly.
Well, but I'd like to ask a question first, if I may, Kate.
Yes.
So we've been focusing on the Clopton scheme. Was that a successor to earlier schemes? And is there any evidence for those?
Very good question. In Fisher's lithographs, you can see no difference artistically between the chancel legend of the Holy Cross and the remaining paintings. But Fisher's fascination with lithography was precisely because he could sort of put his artistic mark on the images. So he says that very clearly. Wheeler suggests that the paintings in the chancel, the Legend of the Holy Cross, were earlier.
Right.
But unfortunately, they were knocked off the walls.
Yeah.
So we've got no way of telling. My hunch is probably their earlier 15th century, and that the nave scheme is what Clopton creates. It's such a coherent scheme with that message throughout it. I'm sure some of his friends and guild members contributed to it.
Yes.
But I think the nave scheme is probably Clopton. My hunch has always been the chancel is slightly earlier, but we'll never know, sadly.
Yeah, but
Victorians.
Yeah, could it have been to do with the fact that the nave had the audience that Clopton was wanting, and the chancel perhaps less so?
Yes, quite possibly. There's a lovely moment when you become Lord Mayor of London. We know from the Carpenter's Liber Albus that the Lord Mayoral procession ends in St Paul's Cloister. So you've had this amazing procession, and then you end in the cloister near Beckett's Chapel, and you are faced with the Dance of Death. So it's this incredibly humbling reminder. Perhaps we should reinstate it for our elected politicians. Who knows?
What a good idea.
That you are faced with a reminder of judgment and mortality at the end of this, and we sort of feel that this is Clopton kind of bringing a little bit of St Paul's back to Stratford, and reminding everybody. It's possible because of this scandal too. One of the discussions, the volunteers think that Clopton comes running home to Stratford because he's been found out, not paying these dues for this £3,000, and he's been humiliated in the Mercer's Hall. Somebody's got it in for him, and he's really cross, and he makes a complaint that he's publicly shamed and humiliated, and everybody's at it. So why shouldn't he import his £3,000 worth of goods? But he obviously goes off in a huff for a couple of years, and that might be how New Place benefits as well.
Okay.
So that's possible.
Yeah.
But the audience very definitely. And the last thing you see when you leave is the Whore of Babylon. So that's a reminder of what not to do in Stratford on a Sunday afternoon, I think.
And what he might have left behind in London. Dorothy has her hand up, I see.
Yes, thank you very much. Kate, you've given us such a lot to think about, but I'd like to take you back right to the beginning of your talk. You talked about the Charter of 1269 and that it was sought for the brethren and the sisters. Unusual, or was this a joint order like the Gilbertines or something? I mean, why was it both sexes?
Most medieval religious guilds are full of women. They love a religious guild, and they're very, very active. So they're called the sisters. And they are, medieval religious guilds are full of women. Medieval craft groups, sometimes called guilds, they usually call themselves crafts or mysteries, very few women. Right. So unless you're a widow and you're running your husband's workshop, you can't join a craft. Women never become masters in medieval guilds, religious guilds or fraternities, but they are very, very active members. So of course, it's really intriguing when we think in York about the mystery plays. Many of our mysteries have religious fraternities associated with them. And indeed, Jeremy Goldberg once suggested that, we didn't know that women didn't act on the wagon plays. I bet they were there behind the scenes, but no, sisters are a very active part of guild life generally.
Thank you.
But Sylvia, I think, has got a question. Sylvia?
Yes, can I ask where they got their pigments from and everything, and who inspired them to paint in that style?
So one of the lovely things about working with Perry Lithgow or other conservators like Tobit Curtis is that they do analysis of pigments. When they conserve a scheme, they can take tiny little fragments and analyze them. So we know that a lot of the pigments that we have here are earth and lake pigments, so they're locally available. They're just as you would source kind of other materials locally. but we also have, we don't have any lapis lazuli here, but we do have some fancy blues, which are, you know, coming from Afghanistan and other places. So they are bringing in, you know, there's copperas, there's all sorts of pigments that they must have been buying. Probably in Stratford on Avon, they would have been getting them from Coventry. We know there's a Painters and Stainers Guild in Coventry. That's quite well documented, or possibly Warwick, but probably Coventry. And we also know we have gold leaf in some places too. So it's you know, they are trading them across Europe, across the globe, and then making their way into London and then into the major towns and cities. They would have been in York. And of course, all of our medieval churches and cathedrals would have been ablaze, a riot of colour. So there was a huge market for this stuff. Kit, our apprentice. So one of the things we were discussing is also what the medium. So sometimes when we talked about Pickering, we talked about people referring to them as frescoes, and they're not usually frescoes in England. They're not on wet plaster. They're the dry, the secco method, straight onto a kind of lime wash or very simple stonework. But our apprentice painter goes on at some length about how much work he does grinding up the pigments and what an important job it is. So it was a new challenge for me. I've never written anything kind of creative before, but we wanted, this was our trail, the Clopton Trail was aimed at families, and that's how we got the lottery funding. So we had to make it it couldn't be Clopton saying, look at my wonderful chapel, because the lottery wouldn't like that, it would be too posh. So we invented Kit, and he's a sort of, you know, look at me, I'm almost ready to be a master. But basically he's had a long night in the ale house the night before, and he's off looking for breakfast. So it's this constant quest for breakfast around Stratford on Avon. And he's, you know, he's saying, what, you don't know about Mr. Stratford Clopton? So we've updated the language, of course, but it seems to have worked really well, actually. And the actor who plays Kit has become a sort of local cult figure. And when we did the launch of the trail, lots of ladies turned up to meet him. And I think they all wanted to adopt him. So like, oh, I'll give you breakfast. Yeah, he was quite overwhelmed. But it was a great scheme. It was a really good way of working with those local partners and benefiting not just the Guild Chapel, but the film company, the acting company. So it's been really exciting.
Right. Moira.
Yeah. Yes, I watched a part of that, the Clopton Trail, and I must say, first of all, I thought, ooh, bar humbug. But in fact, I thought it was very entertaining and really, you know, a very good way in of looking at it. The other question, or that was the observation, I suppose, but the question is, are you going to be tempted to do any judicious restoration as they did at Pickering, or are you going to just leave what you find?
Well, so to come back to your first point, Maura, you're right. My instinct, I do like to share scholarly research with other people. But actually, when you're talking about families and you're talking about the late Middle Ages, it's a really different world for people to get their head around. So we did want something accessible. What's wonderful about the technology that my guys at the university created, this web app, is that the volunteers feel that too. They've spent 2 or 3 years learning about the chapel. They know so much. They know more than I do now. So every time I go to Stratford, they're saying, guess what I've discovered in the archives. So we wanted to find a way of allowing the volunteers' research to come to light. So behind each of the places we talk about, a group of volunteers wrote a blog post, and that's about sort of 2,000 words long, what they wanted to say about their discoveries, what was interesting. So if you're visiting, you know, the family can watch the sort of Kit rubbing his eyes and looking for breakfast, but you can also find out more. You can go into this layered content and read more, or you can do that back in the comfort of your own home. So I think that's a great, I mean, this template we've created now, we are using all over the place because it's a really great way of adding extra content for people who want that information. In terms of judicious adding, not quite on the scale of Pickering, no. Mark and Richard they are award-winning conservators, and what they will do is use deionized water. They will clean the paintings, and they will, if there's, for example, if there's plaster adhering to the surface, we can now remove that very safely. We will have to think very carefully about those later schemes of architecture. We probably won't get permission to remove them, because they are part of that palimpsest of paintings. So where we can increase the sort of legibility of the paintings through careful cleaning and just consolidation, Moira, usually it's just stopping painting from flaking. We very rarely fill in the way that they did in Pickering. So yes, we'll be keeping on the windy side of the Historic England guidance, I can assure you.
Well, I mean, it's my very pleasant task to offer a vote of thanks. I talk about the windy side. I think you're sailing with a wet sail. I mean, it's absolutely amazing what you've uncovered, and how it's put into a context that we can understand today, even if you're not a specialist in late medieval history. And I think that's a hugely important thing to do, because for most people, the belief system, it's another world, and it gets them into that world so that they have a much better understanding of the whole context of the town and the guild and so on. So, but as ever, I mean, delivered with your characteristic wit and ebullience, thank you so much. I think we've all enjoyed it enormously, and sharing with us, you know, such important work. So thank you, Kate. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you. And thank you for coming this evening on a cold and damp evening, when I'm sure there are lots of lovely Christmas things to go and do, or perhaps we're all feeling slightly nervous about that now. But I would also say it's been, I think one of the things that I love about the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust is the fellowship and the camaraderie that comes with working with historic places of worship. And the volunteers have become my friends and my fellow researchers, and I really miss them. And so it's been joyous to reconnect with them this summer, in person as well as on Zoom. We've been doing Zoom lectures all the way through the lockdown, but it's been really great to reconnect with them in person, and then really be promising them that we will get that paneling off the wall, we will look behind it. And thanks to the Pilgrim Trust and some crowdfunding, we will absolutely be doing that starting in March. So I'll let you know what we discover.
Okay, yes, we want the progress report.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Vanessa, for all the setup this evening. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thanks very much for everything. Yeah. And
Thank
happy
you.
Christmas to everyone.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yes.